Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I hope you are all safe during these uncertain times. Thank you for joining us to this discussion. We're meeting at a moment of profound uncertainty for Lebanon and for the region. The war that has been unfolding around us has escalated at remarkable speed over the past 3 weeks, reshaping political calculations, security dynamics, and the balance of power across the Middle East. The regional picture is shifting. Long-standing assumptions are being tested. Deterrence equations that shaped the Middle East for years appear increasingly unstable. Alliances are being recalibrated, and the consequences of this war are extending well beyond the immediate battlefield. The United States and Israel have imposed significant costs on Iran and its network, including severe damage to Iran's decision-making structure and major strikes on military and energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, Iran has succeeded in widening the conflict to the Gulf states and raising the stakes for the region. But also, it has shown it can impose major costs on the global economy through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And while reports of possible negotiations had surfaced, additional US forces are moving into the region. This raises a number of questions. Where is this war heading? Which actors are gaining leverage and which are losing? And what are the implications for regional security as well as the global economy? As for Lebanon specifically, the consequences have already been devastating. Once again, the country has been drawn into a conflict that the Lebanese state did not choose. More than 1 million people have been displaced, a little bit less than 20% of the population. And entire areas in the south have been emptied as Israeli bombardment and ground operations have intensified. And as the risk of a prolonged Israeli presence or an expanded buffer zone in southern Lebanon is becoming increasingly real. So where is Lebanon heading? What scenarios are now realistically on the table? And what does Israel want to achieve in Lebanon? We're very fortunate to be joined by two speakers who are exceptionally well placed to help us think through these questions. Emile Hokayem is Director of Regional Security and Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. His work spans conflict, security, and regional order in the Middle East, and he has written and spoken extensively on these subjects. Greg Carlstrom is Middle East Correspondent for The Economist. His reporting and insightful analysis have consistently helped make sense of complex regional developments. And especially during this war, his work has consistently helped audiences understand not just what is happening, but why it matters. We're grateful to both of them for being with us. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us. And with that, let me turn first to Emile with the opening question. Emile, let us start with a ledger of what the US and Israel have achieved in this war so far. What's the initial assessment for the United States' position after 3 weeks of war? Was it a strategic error, as some have already labeled it? Or does a closer look at the results so far tell a different story?
Thank you, Gianna, and thank you for the opportunity to come back with you and Craig. I suspect we're going to have to do these, not once a year, once every 6 months, or actually once a month, given how things are progressing. Anyway, so look, this is a war of choice, and the US and Israel, could they had one shot to really get it right. They picked the day it started. They picked the capabilities. They designed a very methodical campaign, at least the first phase of the campaign, to achieve maximum effect. They hit 15,000 times and they killed that many people and they disabled that many missile launchers. And then you can look at how many missiles and UAVs have been fired and interception rates and so on. And if it ends, that each party will declare victory, even as each will be in a strategically worse off position. That's the beautiful irony of that war. You can see how everyone is going to spin it one way or another. But I think strategically, they're all come out looking bad at the end of it. But the point is, Iran has a much clearer objective and has escalation options that are real. Iran can hit more places over a longer period of time without necessarily having to achieve direct success, as long as it's creating this uncertainty. And that uncertainty has a direct cost for everyone. And the most important cost is US credibility, US reputation. Look, when you are the US and you have to rush a marine expeditionary units from Okinawa and from San Diego, and you are taking out weapon systems, air defense systems from the Korean Peninsula, and then redirecting weaponry paid for by the Europeans for Ukraine, and you decide, single-handedly to send it to the Middle East and so on. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look like that beyond phase one, you thought through what the escalation ladder is. So I'm very again, I think we have to differentiate between successes, military successes, or even strategic successes, and victory, because there is no victory to be had here. You can identify strategic achievements. And I think, I don't want people to also, go in the other direction. Iran is a much reduced regional power now compared to what it was 3.5 weeks ago, or actually 9 months ago, going back to June. Iran has failed significantly in its deterrence strategy. Its militia partners have not deterred or punished Israel or the US significantly. Its missiles have not deterred Israel. Iran decided to stay under the nuclear threshold all this time, and it turns out that when you stay under the nuclear threshold, you invite actually attacks. You should do the North Korea thing, right? If you get close, you just cross the line. So from Iran's perspective, the strategic failures are immense, and they could come at an immense cost as well. But on the other side, the US in particular, everyone has higher expectations. First, they have to be, they have not just to be operationally brilliant, they're supposed to actually strategically know what they're doing. Well, yeah, not really. The second point is that the US says, or we think that the US has global responsibilities, freedom of navigation. And guess what? The Iranians got the US, at least in this phase, thinking about bargaining, and that over freedom of navigation, over these things. And then suddenly the US looks like the maker of its own problems, right? So everything the US today is seeking to achieve are problems that did not exist on the 27th of February, right? Defending well their Gulf partners, restoring freedom of navigation, even the nuclear disarmament bit. I mean, before the 27th of February, before the 28th of February, so on the 27th, the Iranians had to think, do we really want to try? Do we really want to test? And there were problems in the system. There were disagreements within the system. I think that new system perhaps won't be able to go nuclear, but I think that argument is over, right? If they can, they will, because that's the best form of deterrence. So we're early, but the point is the US looks particularly bad because everyone's expectation of what the US could and should achieve, and because Donald Trump says the same something and its opposite, within the same sentence, essentially. We don't know where we won, we haven't won, the allies are coming, we don't need them, we want a big deal, we can't afford to go without a deal. We're going to take charge of Hormuz, or we'll do it with the new Ayatollah, or by the way, it's not our responsibility. It's really the US that looks completely discombobulated at this point. I am curious if Greg agrees.
Thank you, Emile. I want to move to Greg with first a follow-up question. I mean, what about Israel in this equation, Greg? I mean, from Israel's standpoint, is the outcome an undisputable win, given that, well, basically their primary region adversary has been degraded? And also, what about Iran? I mean, yes, Iran's initial response focused heavily on regional and global economy rather than just military targets. And what has been the economic impact of this strategy? Can we say it succeeded in that sense?
And thank you, Diana. Good to be with you and Emile again. So for Israel, listen, it's too early to say. I think in the short term, certainly for the prime minister, certainly for Benjamin Netanyahu, this is an undisputed success. He has done what he's wanted to do for many, many years. He has gone to war again with Israel's main state adversary. He's done it in partnership with the United States, with the global superpower, and it looks as if he may be able to spend several more weeks at least carrying out airstrikes and degrading Iran's military capabilities. So when Emil says that Iran is going to be a diminished regional power coming out of this war, that's right. And from Israel's perspective, that is a win. Now, in 5 years' time, if Iran has taken a lesson from this, that it needs to go down that North Korea route and build a nuclear deterrent, it won't look like a win at that point from Israel's perspective. So I think it's too early to pass judgment. Again, I think for Netanyahu himself, this has been an accomplishment, and he will use this in his election campaign later this year, and I'm sure he's quite happy about it. But there isn't a unanimity of views in the Israeli security establishment. There are some, not a majority, I would say, but some Israeli officials who think it's actually time to wrap this up. It should have been wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, that it's diminishing returns at this point, continuing the war. And in fact, it might jeopardize not just Israel's long-term position by driving Iran perhaps to a nuclear deterrent, but it might also jeopardize Israel's standing in the United States. If you think about, 75% of Americans who are opposed to this war, it's very unpopular in the US. Israel is already on shaky ground with both the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the more isolationist MAGA wing of the Republican Party. If this war is seen to end badly and Israel is seen to have dragged the United States into it, that's ultimately a very bad thing for Israel's relationship with its main ally, its main foreign backer. So we'll see. It's really too early to pass judgment. For Iran, they've certainly inflicted enormous costs on the world economy, and I think it's important to note that we haven't even really seen the full extent of those costs yet. I mean, in the Gulf, obviously tens of billions of dollars of lost revenue from everything from oil and gas exports to tourism and travel. There's a huge economic blow here that is rippling to other parts of the world. You have energy crises already starting in Asia, shortages of cooking gas in India, in Southeast Asia, governments that are going to 4-day work weeks to try and save energy. But this is only the beginning. If the war were to end tomorrow, we're still looking at a period of several months before oil and gas will start to flow normally or semi-normally out of the Gulf and into world markets. And so the consequences of that in energy markets will be with us probably through the summer, if not into the winter. And then all of the other things that are downstream from oil and gas. You think about agriculture, for example. A lot of fertilizer comes out of the Gulf. They use natural gas as a feedstock to produce fertilizer. That supply has been interrupted just as many farmers in the Northern Hemisphere are planting their crops in the spring. So either they're going to use less fertilizer or they're going to pay more for it. Either way, all of us are going to be paying more for groceries later this year. Helium, which sounds ridiculous. We mostly think of it as, what you use to inflate balloons at a child's party. It's actually a vital input for making semiconductors, for making computer chips. A lot of helium comes from the Gulf. That has been completely cut off. So anything you buy that has a computer chip in it is going to be more expensive going forward because of this war. So the economic consequences are going to ripple out for some time. All of that being said, was this a success for Iran? Again, I think it's too early to say. The goal of this was not just to inflict pain, right? The goal was to inflict enough pain that America was compelled to stop fighting Iran and to deter America or other countries from launching another war against Iran in the future. It hasn't done the former yet, even though Trump clearly seems to be looking for an off-ramp of late. And we don't know if it will do the latter. We don't know if this will be a deterrent. And if this war ends with Gulf states and others seeing Iran as a more serious threat than they did before the war, this may end up actually inviting future conflict with Iran rather than deterring it. So we just don't know yet, is the very short summary of my very long answer.
Thanks, Greg. Emile, so building on what Greg said, can we say confidently that the Iranian regime has successfully forced the world to accept its survival by making the cost of its defeat globally unbearable, basically? Or might things still change?
I mean, in the time horizon that I can, analyze things, which, probably is the next 6 months or a year. I think the Iranian regime has ensured its survival. There will be massive problems for it. There will be problem of resources, of legitimacy, of authority. There will be problems within the new security elite over the right course of action for later. How much you invest in defense and in deterrence? Do you continue sustaining the networks? Do you prioritize a dash for a nuclear weapon? I mean, no one should see the fact that the regime surviving as some kind of, total victory that, that new security elite will be able to leverage and, rebuild some massive power, right? But I would argue that um, I mean the point is we are in a long cycle of conflict. There's a new status quo that doesn't look at all like what existed until the 27th of February, especially in the Gulf region. I mean, that was supposed to be the stable, wealthy part of the region that generated surplus that sometimes was given away as investment aid. Sometimes it was disruptive, think Sudan. Sometimes it was good, or sometimes it was, a dream, like all of us in Lebanon. Hey, will the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris give us the billions that now they won't give us for a number of reasons, right? But fundamentally, this is a region that sought itself as connected to the rest of the world, and having essentially got all these security guarantees, insulated itself from all these problems and so on. And now it is at the heart of this new instability. And that's going to have ripple effect. And the Iranians know that. The Iranians, their pain tolerance is higher. They're willing to kill for the regime. They're willing to die for the regime. That much is clear. They don't have to admit or declare defeat at this point. So we're in for some time, and they know one thing: Donald Trump gets bored. Donald Trump can blame others for shortcomings and or failure on his side. He can turn his back on the whole thing. There's always a possibility that he will sour on Netanyahu himself. So things are very unsettled, and at the moment, just declaring that one side has the decisive upper hand over the other is quite foolish.
Clear. Greg, I mean, if we want to build on this idea regarding the Gulf states, what would you say the position of the Gulf states is today? Are they afraid of what will come next? Are they determined now to face Iran? I mean, we've read today reports on that the UAE plans on joining the coalition for the Strait of Hormuz. So what is the position of the Gulf states today? And is it one position anyhow?
It's not one position. There is some diversity of views in the Gulf. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, you have Oman, which at times has sounded almost sympathetic to Iran over the past few weeks. The Omani foreign minister published an op-ed with us in The Economist a couple of weeks ago where he described Iranian attacks on Gulf states, including his own country, as rational. He said that was the rational thing for Iran to do. Now, analytically, you can argue he's right about that, but if you're the foreign minister, your job is not to be an analyst. Your job is to represent your country. And a lot of people across the Gulf were very, very angry at those comments, at other things the Omanis have said. They are seen as being much too sympathetic to Iran throughout the war. At the other end, you have the UAE, which has gone the furthest in its public criticism of Iran, its public alignment with the United States and Israel. Abdullah bin Zayed, the foreign minister, tweeting a few days ago that we will not negotiate with terrorists. He said seeming to rule out any sort of diplomatic arrangement. You've heard from Anwar Gargash, the president's diplomatic advisor, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the ambassador in Washington. They have all, in their own name, essentially aligned themselves with the US and Israel and urged the Americans to keep going, to finish the job, to continue the war until Iran is no longer able to pose a threat to Gulf countries, as we've seen it do over the past few weeks. The Saudis in private are pretty close, I would say, to the Emirati position. They won't come out and say it publicly. And there have been some leaks over the past few days where some media outlet will report, the Saudis are thinking about joining the war, or the Saudis are urging the Americans on, or whatever. And then the Saudis will issue an official statement denying that they said that. I do think in private, the message the Saudis are sending to the US is very similar to the one that the UAE is sending, but they're not willing to go as far publicly. And then the Qataris are another step removed from that. I'm speculating a bit, but I think there's a bit of disagreement within the Qatari government. There are some officials, the energy minister, for example, who sounds very much like he's eager for a ceasefire. He's been eager for a ceasefire for weeks. There are other people in Qatar, you speak to them, and privately, they seem more aligned with the Saudi point of view of urging the Americans on. For Iran, I think the idea was, the Gulf is the soft underbelly, America's soft underbelly in the Middle East. If you hit it hard enough, they will pressure the United States to stop the war. And of course, they have a lot of influence with Donald Trump. They've personally enriched him and his family. The Qataris gifted him an airplane. And so Iran thought they would use their influence to beg Trump to end the war. By and large, they haven't done that. They haven't joined the war themselves, of course, but they're not telling the Americans to stop. And I think the intensity of the Iranian attacks that we've seen on the Gulf over the past few weeks has hardened the opinions of many policymakers and even many ordinary people in the Gulf. I mean, you speak to people in Qatar, it's interesting, the anger that some Qataris have towards Al Jazeera, their own news channel, which has taken a much more sympathetic line towards Iran than the Qatari government has, or than many ordinary Qataris do. So there is a lot of anger at Iran. There is a message going to Washington of you need to finish the job. But what does that mean? What does finishing the job look like? I mean, no one is entirely sure in practical terms what that means. And are they going to join the fighting themselves? I think they still have concerns about that. One of which is that they might join, and then a week later, Trump might decide, you know what, I'm done, the war's over. In which case, Gulf states are left holding the bag. They've joined the war against Iran only to be left alone. They don't want to risk that. And I think they are also worried about the consequences, the sort of risk-reward calculus of if the Saudis or the Emiratis start carrying out airstrikes in Iran, what is the military benefit of that on top of what the Americans and the Israelis are doing? And does that benefit outweigh the cost of probably much more serious Iranian attacks on your infrastructure? I think for most policymakers in the Gulf right now, the risk still outweighs the reward, and that's making them cautious about getting involved.
So until the moment, you don't see any of them actually being involved in the near future.
I think if certain lines were to be crossed, I think they would have no choice but to get involved. I mean, if the Iranians start attacking desalination plants in the Gulf, that's the doomsday scenario for everyone here because cities become uninhabitable very quickly. So if that happened, I think they would have no choice. If there were a mass casualty Iranian attack that killed a significant number of people in a Gulf country, I think that might force them in. But I think it would take something like that to force their hand, to pull them into the fighting.
If I may, Diana, just to a couple of things. I think Greg is totally right, but I just want to add a few things. The first one is if you're the Gulf states and things worsen and you don't do anything, then you have undermined your ability to deter for the future. The Iranians know exactly what the pressure point is, and so one of the reasons why Gulf governments are thinking about that is not necessarily because of the military effect. It's more about the strategic signaling that is needed. The second point is they need to demonstrate to their own population, to all the foreign workers in the Gulf states and so on, that they also can be responsible for their own security. It's not just passive defense or even active defense, but but some form of that. Now, the issue really for the Gulf states is where do they fit in this picture? Because people talk about it as if you can fly your F-16 or your F-35 or your Typhoon just like that and join the wave. The Americans don't have space for them in the campaign plan, and it takes a lot. When you're operating at that level of technological tempo, it takes a lot to fit in there. And this is not well rehearsed. This is not, a simple operation like most people think, just, you go and do something specific. And the capabilities are also limited. Yes, there are lots of Black Shaheens, missiles and others that can be Firestorm Shadows, can walk you through some of this stuff. But the point is there aren't many capabilities to start, and the tempo will be immense, and they still need to defend themselves. So they have a choice to make. If they go on the offense, it may mean that it will be harder to defend, and it's more important for them perhaps to defend now than to attack. Given the reduction in their own interceptor magazines and stuff. So it's a very difficult problem for the Gulf states. And and Greg put his finger on it. How do you join a campaign if you're not confident that the leader in that campaign, the US or President Trump, may bail out just unexpectedly because he's cutting on costs? There will be always around the corner from Iran. They don't have that luxury. And they would be very exposed if US strategy, if US patience falls short.
Clear. Let's move to Lebanon a bit. I mean, actually, before we move to Lebanon, to wrap this up, on the issue of negotiations, Emile, do you think negotiations are even possible at this stage? How viable is this? And do you see boots on the ground soon in Iran?
I mean, Greg will have probably more updates and more insights, but the way I see it is in Trump's head. I mean, I think in Trump's head, everything is confused at one point. But he would like to think that you can pursue a coercive option alongside diplomacy, right? I mean, that's the theory of the case, the best case scenario in this. And I show you how strong I am while I'm talking to you, so the gun is on the table, and give me what I want. Otherwise, I think the Iranians are not interested in the deal unless it's a very comprehensive deal that includes security guarantees that Israel and the US will never hit Iran again. But I think the priority for the Iranians is to continue using their leverage. And in the Iranian case, they may well miscalculate. They may actually have reached the sweet point where their leverage has peaked now. If they do it too much, then actually, they're at risk of losing it. But I don't see the Iranians as that interested in a deal. And I don't think the Israelis are interested in the deal. I think the Israelis probably have another 2-3 weeks of dynamic bombing in their defense planning. So I don't see that opportunity. I do believe that the Pentagon is generating ideas for Trump, telling him this is going to be the big one. So if we do this, we will avoid a protracted conflict. So let's think of a high intensity, high investment operation that is high impact and has some kind of massive strategic return. I think this is how they're selling him. Attacks on Hormuz, on Qishm, on Karg, or whatever, right? That is that will be the turning point. My view is that there are no real turning points in these wars. It's basically how much you can deal with the attrition and the pain. But I still see the Americans, likely to hit. I think there's kind of past dependency when you do these things. You send the Marines, and then they're there, and you're like, oh, well, already send the Marines. Let me use the Marines, right? It's not like, oh, this is an option, but I'm going to pick that other option. And I think this is how Trump got to that point in terms of the war. Is that there was this buildup, and at one point he's like, okay, I have everything in place, let's go and do it. Rather than a very deliberate strategy of, balancing everything and then thinking hard about what to do at that very last moment. I think he's just, he's a vessel. He's dragged into these things and then made to believe that this is the best possible option.
Interesting. Greg, what is your take on this? And maybe if you can also add a view on what do you think would be an acceptable endgame for the US/Israel versus Iran?
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic about negotiations, about the idea that there is a deal to be reached here if they do end up talking in Pakistan or wherever. I mean, first, because there is just such an enormous gulf between what they're asking for right now. The Americans are asking for more or less the same thing they demanded in the previous two rounds of talks. Iran would have to scrap a large part of its nuclear program, limits on its ballistic missiles, and support for regional proxies and so on. They've asked before, Iran has rejected this before, and Iran right now thinks it has the advantage, it has the upper hand in the conflict, and that Trump is desperate to negotiate and make a deal. So this wouldn't be the moment, I think, when Iran would be inclined to make substantial concessions. And then they have their demands as well. It's not just asking for sanctions relief. It's asking for the closure of American military bases in the region. It's asking for reparations for the war, for some sort of new arrangement around the Strait of Hormuz. And that's obviously not going to be acceptable for the US, for Israel, or for many of America's allies in the Middle East. So you have to resolve that gap in positions. You have to resolve the gap in motivation, where the Iranians don't think this is their moment to make concessions. And I agree with Emile. I think this is probably the peak right now of their ability to extract concessions from America, and they might overplay their hand and wait too long to cut a deal. I think it gets more complicated from them going forward. And then even if you could reach the broad outlines of a deal, it gets complicated from there, right? Because this is an arms control agreement. It's about how do you monitor Iran's nuclear program? How do you ensure compliance? How do you decide, what the limits are on the range and quantity of its ballistic missiles, and who's going to check that? And what happens if Iran attempts to cheat? The JCPOA, the nuclear deal from 2015, say what you will about it, love it or hate it, it was a detailed agreement where negotiators spent 2 years haggling over every comma in that agreement. The Trump administration is not going to do that. Steve Witkoff is not going to fly back and forth to Islamabad every week to debate how many centrifuges the Iranians might be allowed to operate. So the risk is that if they do a deal, you end up with a deal that looks like the Gaza ceasefire from 6 months ago, where it's 20 bullet points. There's a couple of, very easy concessions in stage one, and then you leave all of the hard stuff for phase two. Here we are 6 months on from that ceasefire in Gaza. There's been no progress on phase two. Israel still occupies half of Gaza. Hamas controls the other half. Nothing has been rebuilt. If something similar happens with a deal between America and Iran now, I mean, that deal potentially leaves the Iranians with 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. It leaves them with whatever remains of their ballistic missile arsenal. It's an unacceptable outcome. I think it should be, not just for America, not just for Israel, but again for other countries in the region. So I think that's the final hurdle to getting to a deal, is who's going to work out the details. And then just briefly on, you were asking about end states. I think for Israel, an end state that would be okay for them is you smash the place up, you degrade Iran, you degrade the regime as much as possible, you try to push it towards state collapse, state fracture, and then you leave. You don't have to deal with the consequences of that. Their end state is just to inflict as much damage on their main adversary as they can. That is not, or it should not be, such a desirable outcome for America, because state collapse in Iran is going to have knock-on effects in the region, weapons falling into the hands of militias or rival actors, refugee flows, economic consequences, all sorts of other things. So I don't think, or at least at the beginning of this, I didn't think America wanted that sort of state collapse scenario in Iran. The longer this goes on, though, I think implicitly, the more America and Israel are being pushed into a sort of de facto alignment on that. A prolonged war does risk state collapse in Iran, which was a impoverished, divided country ruled over by a somewhat inept regime before all of this. So a prolonged war only makes that worse. It only pushes Iran further towards collapse. And then I think for Iran, what they want ideally is for this to be the last war. That is the way they talk about it. They want to know that when this war ends, we're not doing this again in 6 months or a year. We have some sort of guarantees that America and Israel are not going to keep doing this. That is really what they are focused on, more than sanctions relief, more than any of the other perks that America might be able to offer in a deal. What they want to know is that their position is secure going forward.
So, very quick question before I move to Emile. Do you see this lasting for a few more weeks? I mean, you just mentioned Iran is not interested today in a negotiation. Israel is probably, of course, interested in extending this. Do you see this, I mean, extended for a few more weeks? What's the timeline in your
That's
opinion?
Yeah, that's my assumption right now that we're looking at least until mid-April, I would say. I think we will get to a point where both sides are probably exhausted and where they decide to do some sort of, not even a ceasefire, don't call it a deal, don't call it a ceasefire, just some sort of interim agreement that stops the fighting because neither side sees enough benefit to continuing it. But I don't think we're there yet, and I think it's going to take several more weeks to get there.
Okay. Emile, want to move a bit to Lebanon. First, do you think it's conceivable that the Iranian regime might sacrifice Hezbollah as a bargaining chip to ensure its own survival? Do you think that this could be on the table at some point?
Thank you for the easy question, Diana. No, I don't think so. I do think that it remains a very useful card for Iran. I think, the way Iran looks at it is that Israel is likely to, go hard after Hezbollah in the coming weeks and months. And Iran has every interest in keeping that front burning, even as fighting in the Gulf wins down, if it wins down. In their view, either they get that big comprehensive agreement that Greg and I were talking about. Greg talked you through the complexity of what that agreement looked like. I mean, I suspect the Iranians would go and say, "Hey, Lebanon is we need to also offer guarantees to Hezbollah in a coming phase," which then makes it so much more difficult to achieve anything in the Gulf per se. But the Iranians would make that. I think that front will keep burning regardless of what's happening in the Gulf, and it's key to understand Iran today, despite the fact that its missiles and UAVs are more accurate and that they figure out a way to impose a bit of a greater cost on Israel, Iran understands that it cannot achieve strategic effect against Israel at this point. So, and yes, they're sending stuff. It's partly for some strategic reason to retaliate in kind, to show that they can stay on the escalation ladder and so
So
on.
the Lebanese are dying in vain?
I mean, to some extent, yeah. I mean, I'm okay. You just hurt me
I
here,
make the
Jana.
question harder.
I mean, yeah. The point is this: it's not a strategic front anymore. This is now, Hezbollah as a strategic actor that was supposed to deter and punish Israel with strategic effect. That Hezbollah doesn't exist anymore. The Hezbollah that is fighting in the south now, yes, can stall in Israeli campaign, can bleed a little bit the Israelis, they can take out capabilities and so on. But that's a ground operation that has some conventional features, but also fights like a guerrilla force, and will have some successes, but will not change the Israeli strategic thinking. Hezbollah remains most powerful as an instrument as a force that can coerce and intimidate within Lebanon. Other political parties, civil society, the state itself, and so on. And that, by the way, for Iran is good enough. As long as Hezbollah remains the most powerful Lebanese actor, regardless of what Lebanon looks like at the end of that, then it's a win for them. So I don't see them as writing off Hezbollah anytime soon. I don't think that's really part of the thinking in Tehran. If only we could let go of Hezbollah, then they won't ask us about the missiles. That's not how Tehran is thinking about the trade-offs.
Thanks. Greg, following up on this, what do you think the Israelis are trying to achieve militarily in Lebanon today? And do you think they will indefinitely occupy the area south of Litani?
I'm not sure the Israelis know what the Israelis are trying to achieve militarily in Lebanon at this point. I mean, some of this is, narrowly there is pressure coming from residents of northern Israel who want to see a military incursion into southern Lebanon because they're worried about their own safety on the border. So that is some of it. Is there broader strategic thinking going on when it comes to Lebanon right now? I don't really think there is. I think this is sort of a campaign on autopilot. I mean, you don't really have dissenting voices in Israel at the moment when it comes to this. You've had 2.5 going on 3 years now of perpetual warfare, and the prime minister is very happy to have a state of perpetual warfare because he thinks it helps him politically. And you have a lot of other political figures in Israel who are afraid to challenge him because they think it'll hurt them politically. So you don't have anyone pushing back asking what is the strategic aim of this. You have plenty of people in the Israeli security establishment who think going into Lebanon again, occupying southern Lebanon again, we know how that ends. They've done it before. Hezbollah is here today as a result of what Israel did in Lebanon in the 1980s. And so there are plenty of Israeli generals and spies and other officials who don't want to repeat that and don't see any strategic advantage to occupying southern Lebanon indefinitely. But are those views affecting what's happening at a political level? I'm not sure that they are at the moment. And so it's a policy on autopilot, I would say.
The Israelis, Greg, have repeatedly mentioned that they would be continuing their campaign in Lebanon, regardless of what happens in Iran. How do you see this playing out?
I mean, that is what they are communicating, and that is what they are preparing for. I think whether or not they're able to do that, some of that will depend on Donald Trump. Does he want to rein in Israel after the war in Iran is over? Does he also want to rein in Israel in Lebanon and be able to come out and say, look, I brought peace to the Middle East. I ended not one, but two wars in the region. And never mind that they're all connected. And I started the first one. So maybe he wants to do that. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he just loses interest in the whole thing and moves on to trying to overthrow the government in Cuba, which he's also talking about doing right now. We don't know how much attention he's going to devote to the region after the war. So I wouldn't take it as a foregone conclusion that Trump is going to restrain the Israelis post-war. There's also, as we've been talking about, the question of whether that factors into a ceasefire agreement between the US and Iran. You can imagine them getting stuck in a position where the Iranians demand as part of the ceasefire, we want you to restrain Israel, force it to withdraw from Lebanon, end the war there. The Americans say, okay, well, we want you to end your financial and military support for Hezbollah in return. They can't make any progress on that, and they decide, okay, this is something for phase two. This is something that we're going to leave for future negotiations, and then it doesn't end up helping Lebanon. So in neither case, Trump doing this unilaterally or Trump and Iran coming to an agreement, in neither case do I think it's a foregone conclusion that that will restrain Israel. And then you're sort of reliant on Israel to restrain itself, which anyone who's watched Israel over the past 2.5 years would understandably doubt that it's going to do.
Thanks, Greg. Emile, one last question on Lebanon before we move to concluding remarks and then open the floor for Q&A. Maybe you can also comment on the same question I addressed to Greg regarding what Israel wants in Lebanon. Do you see them taking more permanent control of the south of Lebanon? Do you see them trying to control the Bekaa in some way? Because we've been reading that they might also try to control the Bekaa. What do you think their end game is here?
I mean, look, I would trust Greg's view on this more than mine, but I will still offer mine. I think that this is a very different Israel that thinks in terms of a security doctrine that demands territorial expansion and control. What we see in Syria, what I think is happening in the West Bank and Gaza, means these are clear attempts at Israel securing territory that it sees as strategic. I mean, obviously, what they see in West Bank and Gaza is a bit different from elsewhere, but the point is there are security requirements, military requirements on Israel's side. That's how they see it. And I think southern Lebanon is part of that thinking. I do believe the most probable scenario is a Golan Heights kind of scenario where you move in, contrary to 78 and 82, there was some displacement of population, but it wasn't a comprehensive one. Now this time they don't want to rule over populations that could resist them, can be disloyal to the occupation and so on. So I suspect that you will see long-term displacement or even depopulation of those areas. And then, at the end of that process, a desire to, annex the land. I still think annexation is the more likely scenario. Is it 70%? No, compared to others. But is it 35%? Yes. Greg has mentioned all these Israeli officers who were scarred by their experience in Lebanon before, and they don't want a repeat of the occupation. Yeah, I agree. They don't want occupation. But if you kick out the population, you can reframe the problem and say, well, this is no longer about occupation of people. You don't have to manage that. You're occupying territory. Then you're building a very high wall. You're maintaining air superiority, intelligence superiority, and you're keeping you're fighting the other sides, the others above that wall, essentially. And I think this is a trajectory that is extremely concerning because it means that Lebanon will be in turmoil for forever. At this point, you will have a new occupation, a desire to resist that. It validates Hezbollah's narrative, even though Hezbollah invited all that with its many failures. Just to be clear. And then you have the second order and third order effects on Lebanon, on domestic politics, on communal tensions, on the blame game. Is it the state who's too weak? Is it Hezbollah who invited it, and so on? So, and the way I see it is that Israel today is not interested in managing or mitigating second and third order consequences. Greg talked about the future of Iran. I suspect that also applies to the future of Syria or Lebanon. If Israel is in a way creating its own ring of fire, the way Iran had a ring of fire at one point, that's what Israel is replicating. If there is chaos on the other side, fine. As long as we maintain our freedom of operation, our technological intelligence superiority, and we can do what we want when we do it. And this is why you see a number of countries in the region extremely uncomfortable with that new Israel, including in the Gulf. I don't necessarily see this rush to build new strategic relations with that specific Israel, because it isn't a factor of destabilization. And in the Levant, what happens in Lebanon would have an impact on what happens on Syria, on Jordan. And that's not good news for the other regional powers.
Thank you, Emile. Picture is quite bleak. Concluding with the wider picture, if you want to zoom out a bit, Greg, do you think that we will see a new regional order after this war? Would the Gulf states realign? Will we see a hardening of the US-Israeli alignment of the GCC? How do you see the different players positioned after this war?
So I'll take those in turn, the three questions there. On the question of the Gulf states, sort of their arrangements. I mean, you would think coming out of this, if there was ever a moment when the Gulf states would get together and realize that they need to meaningfully collaborate for their own mutual defense, this would be it. But I think you can never go wrong taking the other side of that bet in the Gulf, whether it comes to defense or setting up a GCC railway or a GCC common currency. They have been talking about all of these things for many, many years, and they never come to fruition. And I'm skeptical that coming out of this war, we're going to see closer Gulf alignment on these things. I mean, remember the backdrop to this. Just a couple of months ago, before the war started, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the President of the UAE, were not on speaking terms because of divergent policies in Yemen and Sudan and elsewhere. Okay, they're speaking now. They had a call shortly after the war started, and there's dialogue between the two, but that bad blood and that divergent policy has not gone away. So I would like to see more coordination amongst Gulf countries after this, but I'm doubtful, skeptical that that's going to happen. Will it push them into closer alignment with America? I'm not sure they have a choice in the short term. I think if the war ends well somehow, if this all comes to a conclusion from the perspective of Gulf states, that is positive, where Iran is no longer a threat to them and they don't have to worry anymore, and then they'll be very happy with America, and bygones will be bygones, and they'll forget their unhappiness about how this war was started and how it's been waged. If the war ends badly, if Iran is still able to threaten shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz, if it's still able to threaten Gulf states and Gulf economies, they're going to have no choice in the short term, I think, but to hew closer to America. They're very worried about ending this war with Iran sort of running a protection racket in the neighborhood where it demands trade, investment, money from Gulf states in return for quiet. And they don't have an alternative. It's not like you can rely on Russia or China to fill a major security role in the region. European countries are probably too weak to fill that role. And so you're, in the short term, stuck with America. But you're going to have some very profound questions about the nature of that security relationship. The reason that you saw America as your security guarantor for all these years is you thought it would deter external attack. That's not very useful when your security guarantor is the one that starts a war that invites external attack. And so I think there are going to be some difficult conversations that Gulf states have with America about that relationship. But I'm not sure they have anywhere else to go in the short term. They can try to diversify. They can, Qatar will no doubt deepen defense relations with Turkey. Other countries will look to the Pakistanis and other actors and try to find additional security partners. But if you're looking for a great power, you don't really have an alternative to the US. On the Israel part, I do not think that they are going to come out of this war and run towards Israel. I mean, you talk to the Israelis and they say the moment the war ends and we're going to see, 3 or 4 new Arab states join the Abraham Accords and normalize with us. And I just don't believe that. I think first, you can't set aside the other context. Yes, people in the Gulf are very angry at Iran right now, but that doesn't mean they've fallen in love with Israel. They haven't forgotten Gaza. They're looking at what Israel is doing in Syria, what it's doing in Lebanon. I mean, if this war ends with Israel occupying a chunk of South Lebanon and a chunk of Syria and half of Gaza, I don't see Arab states lining up to normalize with that Israel. There's also a lot of anger directed at Israel right now. And in some cases, I think it's because you can't be angry at Donald Trump. You can't afford to piss him off by being angry at him. And so countries in the Gulf are directing their anger at Israel instead. They think Israel dragged America into this war. They think this is a war that is being fought primarily for Israel's interests at the expense of Gulf states. I think that's a bit unfair. I mean, Trump is a big boy. I think Trump deserves the blame here too. He wasn't dragged into this by Israel. Trump has agency in this. But again, because Gulf states can't take out their frustrations on America, I think they're going to take it out on Israel. And then I think narrowly, when it comes to Saudi, also the question of normalization, it's very clear coming out of this, there's a sense that there is a UAE-Israel bloc in the region, right? And the Saudis don't want to join that bloc. They don't want to be seen as a junior partner in the Emirati-Israeli axis in the region. And so I think when the war ends, they're going to be a bit hesitant. I mean, before the war, the message from MBS was, we'll normalize, but in a few years, and Israel has to do some things first. I suspect that is still going to be the message. I don't think they're going to rush to normalize when the war ends.
Thanks, Greg. Emile, for you, on a global scale, will this war be remembered as a turning point? Are we moving, again, same question, are we moving toward a new world, a new global order, or will it just be a period of global disorder after all of this is done?
I mean, I think this war is accelerating and aggravating the disorder that was already taking hold. I don't think we're moving towards a new order. That much is clear. I think the strains within the Western alliance, for instance, are quite real. Yes, there is the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte who really want to support Trump. But aside from that, I mean, across Europe, the second and third order effects of that war are now becoming very obvious to everyone, and there's a clear desire not to align with the US on this. But the economic impacts, the supply chain impacts, the potential impact for NATO and so on are significant. And I go back to one thing. If you're sitting in Europe now, your biggest issue is Ukraine, Russia. And that war first revived Russia's prospects. Russia today has less of an interest in reaching any negotiated solution in Ukraine. It has diverted significant American attention and resources. It has offered Russia an opportunity to bleed the US, possibly China as well, on the cheap. They're not taking the blows. The oil price is going up, so that's good for your coffers. I mean, until recently, the Russians were struggling. So it's and then you have the other aspect, which is the really the big one, which is US China. If you're China, let's be honest, the past few years haven't been easy. I mean, Xi Jinping has decapitated his own military. The Chinese economy is not in the best possible shape. Yes, China, looks good from far, but there are real structural issues there. And then you had that competition with the US, but then suddenly the US is seen as the big disruptor, not China. China can look at how the US is doing things in the Gulf and learn military lessons about what it means for Taiwan. They see the US struggling to keep up its munition levels and so on. So I think all in all, these other actors, yes, they will pay an economic price for that. But geopolitically, I think the continued erosion of US standing, of US credibility, is very real. Again, I don't want to suggest that people will turn their back on the US. If you're South Korea or Japan, you don't have a choice. You're stuck with them, even as the US, makes your oil, your petrochemicals, and a bit everything else a lot more expensive. But there are your technological partners. There's no one else really to talk to about these big issues. So I think it's gonna aggravate what's already bad. It's not a turning point. It's just confirmation that don't rely on a wise Washington to calibrate policy in a way that benefits the most, including itself. Because the US thinks about the greater public good. We're way beyond that phase, if we ever were in it. But
okay, thanks, Emile. We already have so many questions on the chat. I'm gonna try to go over each and every single one of them, starting with Rumana Nasser. So Rumana is basically saying that the big picture shows obviously that this conflict will redraw not just the Middle East map, but most importantly, the world order map. And for her, the question is today, will the Israeli-US Gulf regimes survive this conflict and the Epstein files ripples, especially that Russia and China are fully involved in the backstage with the weakening of US hegemony on Middle East and its grip on oil and gas? Greg, do you want to take that? So will it's building on actually the previous question that I just asked. So will the Israeli-US Gulf regime survive this conflict, especially that Russia and China are fully involved in the backstage with the weakening of US hegemony on Middle East and its grip on oil and gas? Maybe in 2 minutes?
Easy. Very, very easy to do that in 2 minutes. No, listen, I think the Gulf countries will come out of this with some hard questions about their political economic model, right? I mean, as Emile was saying before, they have been premised on this idea for many, many years that they are in the Middle East, but they're not really in the Middle East because the conflicts that plague the rest of the region somehow don't affect them. And so they are going to have some difficult questions to ask, but I think it's too early to, there's a lot of doomerism out there about Dubai is done and the Gulf states are done and this is the end of the Gulf states. I don't think that's true. They are still going to have advantages and things to recommend them. I mean, they still have financial resources. They are still attractive places for people to do business and park their money and buy apartments and so on and so forth. So that hasn't gone away, but it's, I think, about how you navigate a scenario where there is risk now. There is a risk premium in the Gulf that wasn't there before. For Israel, I think, let's see. I think, again, the really important consequence of this is going to be what it means for the Israel-US relationship. And the conversation in Washington right now, I mean, there are a lot of people. There are people that I talk to in Washington who I'm surprised at the level of anger that they are aiming at the Israelis right now, who think that Israel led Donald Trump by the nose, dragged him into this conflict. This is not in America's interests at all. They have different reasons for thinking that. Some of them are isolationists. Some of them think we need to be focused on these other conflicts, worried about a possible conflict over Taiwan, focused on Ukraine. They think it's a question of priorities. But there is a tremendous amount of anger directed at Israel. And I think we're underestimating the consequences of that in the long run. You couple that with the shift in public opinion that happened post October 7th throughout the Gaza war because of Israel's conduct in Gaza, the way US public opinion towards Israel shifted over the past few years, coupled with now what this war is doing to, let's say, elite opinion or official opinion in Washington, particularly in the Republican Party, I think that's going to have very serious consequences for Israel going forward. How that plays out, I don't want to make a detailed prediction, but I think it really will impact the relationship for the long term.
Thanks, Greg. Maya is asking, do you see the miscalculations of Trump's administration in this conflict as leaving Russia the primary beneficiary, particularly in terms of eased oil-related sanctions? Do you think this outcome was deliberate or simply a miscalculation?
I think it was a miscalculation. I mean, you look at everything that the Trump administration has been doing around energy over the past month. First, easing the sanctions on Russia, then not just Russia, easing the sanctions on Iran. I mean, this ridiculous scenario where you are letting the country that you are fighting in a war export oil, not at a discount to China anymore, but at full price, or in some cases, actually at a premium. India, just a couple of days ago, the main refiner in India agreed to purchase a cargo of Iranian oil, and they're paying a premium of, I think, $7 a barrel above Brent crude prices. So Iran, okay, there are questions about can they access all of this money? Fine. But Iran, in theory, is making a profit off of this. I think it all goes back to the administration did not think the war was going to go on as long as it did, and did not put enough weight on the scenario that Hormuz would be closed. That's something that the Pentagon has been planning for decades. I mean, the idea of securing the flow of oil and gas out of the Gulf, that has been a bedrock of America's Middle East policy going back to Jimmy Carter, right? So it's something that the Pentagon has planned for and has drawn up scenarios for and was aware might happen. But I think at a political level, the Trump administration just didn't put enough weight on that. Thought, we'll find our Delsey, or the regime will cave, or something will happen and this war will be over, in a matter of days. And just did not do the adequate planning for the closure of Hormuz. And so, yes, now absolutely, Russia is one of the main beneficiaries of this. They were in a difficult economic situation going into this war. Their economy was really starting to show signs of strain after years of sanctions and years of war spending and putting the whole economy on a war footing. And so it's a blessing from God. If you're Vladimir Putin, you feel like this is a blessing from God.
Thanks, Greg. Dana is addressing a question to Emile. Do you see the Gulf joining the war? What's the threshold? I mean, we've talked about this earlier, but if you can just go over it like in 2 minutes.
I mean, just to echo what was said earlier, I mean, I think it would take something really big and bad for the Gulf states to really take that risk. And when I say big and bad, I certainly don't wish it. Just, as an analyst, walking through it. Certainly, critical infrastructure, power plants, desalination plants, high casualty event, or an attempted attack at leadership directly. I mean, this hasn't happened yet, but if the Iranians were to say, we're going to go after, some presidential palace or royal court somewhere and whatever, I mean, just to that I think would have a huge impact. And I think if they were if one of these attacks were to happen, it could have two effects. One is solidarity, is to say, okay, if they took out a desalination plant in X country, it could happen in Y country. So we need to show deterrence by punishment, and go to the Americans and say, give us a big target, in the operational plan, and we'll go and take it out. Or it could drive the Gulf states further. You can see a move to say, okay, the way to avoid this is to move away from the party that was hit. Okay? And that goes back to what Greg was saying, is that despite everything, at that moment, I don't think we see the level of strategic coordination and alignment between the Gulf states that would be, the required response at a time like this one. It could happen the day after. I think that the day after, when the Gulf states sit down and say, okay, what did we get wrong in terms of our defense, in terms of our conventional deterrence and so on, we need to do more. I'm still relatively optimistic that the conversation between them can actually improve on defense issues. But in this moment of crisis, I think it's very difficult to find that alignment, because the risk profiles are so different.
Thanks, Emile. Samer is asking, I'll get back to the Lebanese questions afterwards, Nadim and the others. Samer is asking, do you believe there's any current kind of indirect support from international powers like China or Russia by reloading the Iranian military arsenal? Can this indirect support jump into direct interference in case the war oscillates, hitting their strategic red lines? Emile, do you want to take?
Look, we have evidence that, or we've seen reports that the Russians have been helping the Iranians, and that wouldn't be surprising because the Iranians were present almost on day one, helping the Russians in Ukraine. This is not an alliance. This is a defense partnership that works well for both sides. No one's going to ride to the other one's rescue by sending thousands of troops and deploying capabilities and whatever, but they understand that if the goal is to bleed or bog down the US, the Europeans, and so on at in a deniable way, saying why not? Now the problem is, contrary to Ukraine now, where they're not in big enough American targets that the Russians could take down and cause mass American casualties, and that would change. Force America to get more involved in the war. If Russia were to help Iran and Iran were to succeed in hitting a destroyer in Arleigh going into the Strait of Hormuz, or if there is Russian FPV technology, first-person view drones deployed on the battlefield in Karg, and somehow 300 Marines were to die or whatever, then it changes things, right? So for Russia, managing its exposure to the Iranian theater is going to be difficult, right? I mean, Iran wasn't going to pay a price for its support to Russia, a military price for its support to Russia in Ukraine, but Russia has to think very carefully about what it could do that in turn can turn Iran into some lethal force against the Americans, because that could be problematic. But are they involved? Yes, there's technology. They will be, plenty of other, small ways that they can help. There can be transfer of expertise, of knowledge. And by the way, from what we see now, actually, the Iranians have already learned quite a lot from the Russians, probably much more than what the Americans have learned from the Ukrainians and transmitted to the Gulf states. So we see that spread in expertise and technology across arenas. The Chinese, I think it's a different story. They don't want to be involved. They want to look from far. Yes, they may send some capability here and there, but I mean, it's important to understand for China, their main Middle East interlocutors, partners, are the Gulf states at this point. It's not Iran. It's not the elusive promise of Iran. They're not going to take a massive risk on that. It's not worth it from their perspective. So if the Americans bleed, good, but they're not going to significantly contribute to that.
So Russia has much more skin in the game than the Chinese in supporting Iran. I'm going to combine two questions for Nadim Metta and Labib Abu Daher, who are asking about Lebanon specifically. So from Lebanon's lens, if we consider three possible scenarios, US and Israel achieving their military goals, two, failure to do so, three, reaching a negotiated settlement or agreement to end the war. How would each of these three scenarios reflect onto Hezbollah's reaction and future internally? And Nadim is asking also, what options does the Lebanese state have today to minimize the clear negative consequences and obvious risks of this moment? The silence of the president is deafening. It feels like they have degraded their role to an efficient NGO managing humanitarian aid. What am I missing? Greg, and then maybe Emile.
I completely agree with what Nadim is saying about the president. I mean, the statement that he put out the other day about how Israel's actions in southern Lebanon looked like a prelude to a ground invasion of southern Lebanon. He sounded like one of these open source intelligence accounts on Twitter, not like the president of the country who was going to be invaded. I mean, his silence really has been striking. And I think that gets to the bigger question about what options does the Lebanese state have today? Not many, because of inaction over the previous 18 months. I think it's been striking how little people have been speaking out about Lebanon. Since the war began, since Hezbollah entered the war. You look at, what Arab states have been saying about Lebanon, not much. European states, okay, they've been offering financial support and other things, and Macron is getting involved, which is always a bad thing, as we all know from experience. But Arab states have been silent about this. They're frustrated with the president. I think he hasn't done enough over the previous year and a half. You had this very bizarre situation where the president, I think, would have had the power to push things when it comes to Hezbollah, but didn't have the will to do that, chose to go very slow and to be very cautious. And Nawaf Salam was actually saying all the right things and seemed to be much more aggressive when it came to wanting to get a grip on Hezbollah, but didn't have the power to do it. And so I think there are a lot of countries, both around the region and around the world, that think Lebanon missed an opportunity to do something about that. And Lebanon is now left in a situation where it doesn't have many levers to pull to try and prevent an Israeli invasion. And on the other question about what the scenarios between the US and Israel and Iran might mean, I guess, for Lebanon, I mean, I think whatever happens in the broader war, to what Emile was saying earlier about Hezbollah as a strategic actor versus as an internal actor, I think it's finished, arguably, as a strategic actor able to deter and punish the Israelis. It is not going to be allowed to go back to that point because Israel now, its post-October 7th security doctrine, it's not based on what actions its adversaries take. It's focused on what capabilities its adversaries have. And so if it sees an adversary trying to acquire more capabilities, it is going to try and stamp them out. It is this much more aggressive Israel now. So Hezbollah being able to rebuild to a point where it can threaten Israel, whatever happens with the broader war in Iran, I don't think Israel is going to allow that, which leaves Hezbollah as an actor inside of Lebanon, as an actor that is able to intimidate and perhaps go back to assassinating or I think that is, no matter what happens in the broader war, that is likely to be where Hezbollah's focus is going forward.
Thanks, Greg. A question to Emile, maybe. What do you think of reports that Qatar has separately de-escalated with Iran after Ras Laffan attack? They've not had any attack in almost a week and are mandating private sector goes back to office and schools go back next week. You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Qataris have been careful in not turning up the heat. None of the public messages or the private leaking and conversation with journalists and analysts and so on compared to what we hear from the Saudis or the Emiratis and so on. I think that and you will have seen Dr. Majid Al-Ansari recently, having the line was the Iranians are going to be around forever. There's no real military solution. We know we're going to have to talk politically to figure out like a negotiated outcome and so on. Does that amount to a deal? I wouldn't say so. There are probably some signaling. You don't do this. We'll constrain here and so on. These are understandings, perhaps, but I don't think it's some kind of agreement or something that amounts to that. I think, and a number of countries, are thinking about how to deal with the Iranians at this point, because there's no, I think, clear understanding of where the US will go. So if there's no clear direction from Washington about what the likely outcomes, off-ramps are, then people are going to, think about their own equities. But I wouldn't also overstate that. I wouldn't say that this is, strategic in nature, that somehow the Iranians will no longer hit Qatar. It can be a very temporary thing that reflects, a specific Iranian calculation at this point.
Thanks, Emile. We have two comments that I'm going to read in the chat. So Dr. Abed Haider is saying, the way I see the picture is Israel war led by American against Iran, Iran under siege for 45 years versus US with all its capabilities, joined by Israel with the support of all European and Gulf by Yemen or another, yet Iran still stands. When missiles are silenced and either party impose its will against the other, then strategic victory will be declared. I don't think both speakers understand the real essence of relationship between Party of God and Iran. All Israeli investment throughout the last 15 months and September 2024 war has vanished. Look at yesterday, the number of tanks destroyed. Okay, thank you for your comment, Dr. Abed. Does anyone want to react very quickly?
I mean, I think we have to be careful not to overstate Iran's achievements and in all this. It's not because they are achieving some successes and have been able to stand up that, I mean, you have to look at the whole ledger. This is a country that probably invested around $500 billion directly or indirectly, so the cost of sanctions, isolation, and so on, into a nuclear program that is, now buried underneath and so on. That's a country that invested massively in its missile arsenal, only to see that the arsenal did not really deter. And, it's grim, and you'll forgive me for that. But even if you look at the accounting, how many Israelis are being killed versus how many Iranians, how will the quality of life of an Iranian be affected the next day compared to the quality of life of their enemies? On Hezbollah, I mean, again, it's ugly, but, look at the KIA ratio, the killed in action ratio. Again, it doesn't compare. So, I have to say sorry.
What's the ratio?
I mean, it's how many Lebanese have been killed all in all, around 1,000 at this point. I mean, more. I mean, and
Yeah.
exactly what the breakdown is. Are there more than 10, 15 Israelis who have been killed? And then again, I hate what I'm doing. Please don't get me wrong. But I want to say is that no, the party of God is not achieving some, incredible defense of the land. They have zero air cover. Yes, they can fight tough on the ground, but again, with no strategic effect. When your HQ is gone, when you've lost so many secretary generals, when you've lost all these, there is a cumulative effect to all that. And fundamentally, I would say people, I think, don't appreciate that there has been a breakdown in trust and credibility within the so-called axis of resistance. These guys first did not understand the type of war they were involved in from day one. Despite the hits that Israel took the first few days of that cycle in October 2023. Israel had escalation dominance all along. The others were in an attritional war that they didn't want. The whole point of the Axis was to avoid a no-lot war. And it was supposed to be about harassment, about winning through 1,000 small cuts. And they had their all-out war. So my point is there are real strategic failures along the way that cost billions and it's not just the money. It's, the money is just a way to capture all that. So just because they're doing well specifically at the moment in some arenas and making the Americans in particular look bad doesn't mean it's a victory. It's very far from that.
Thanks, Emile. One comment and one final question before we wrap up. So Bassam is saying, don't you think Lebanon's biggest problem is corruption and the government's inability to implement reforms? The failure to find a solution to the blocked deposits problem and reform the banking system demonstrates the superiority of the banking lobby and its allies over the state and all constitutional powers. I'll allow myself to answer that, Bassam. We definitely think that this is a huge problem. We've been addressing this. Unfortunately, it's not the subject of our call tonight, but we'd be happy to have a discussion around this sometime soon. We will definitely have a discussion around this sometime soon. We'll also have a discussion on the costs of this war and how Lebanon can get out of this, with the proper reforms and with the proper approach. So thank you for your comment. Nadim Matta has one final question. Do you see any path forward for Lebanon that does not involve occupation in the south and civil war everywhere else? And if so, how can the state increase the odds of this path? Come on, give us something positive, guys, at the end of this call. Greg, you want to take that?
I'm not sure I have anything too positive. I mean, listen, I think the state should be doing everything it can to convince both Arab and Western allies that there is some credible plan for disarming Hezbollah, for doing the things that the president and the government said they were going to do when they took power. There's a lot of skepticism about that. Yes, there have been some piecemeal steps. The government decision around its weapons recently, expelling the Iranian ambassador, things like that. I mean, these are steps, but they don't solve the underlying problem. I think you have to be able to convey to your allies that you're serious, because the sense, again, amongst both Western and Arab allies, is that the government is not serious about doing these things or not empowered to do these things. And so I think the only sort of narrow path that might convince the Americans or others to restrain the Israelis and to prevent an occupation of South Lebanon is don't waste time anymore. There is no more time to waste. The government has to actually be serious about this now.
Thank you, Greg. And with that, we wrap up our discussion tonight. Thank you again, Emile and Greg, for being with us. This conversation came at a moment when clarity is especially valuable. We're really grateful for the analysis. It was very insightful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good evening, and we hope to see you again very soon for another policy session, hopefully. Thank you.